case was the UAE84, Emirates 94. Their sentences had ended. They were ready to be released. However, they did not know what was awaiting them. It was beyond their imagination.
The UAE84.
The charges are the same, but the consequences are even harsher and more brutal. More than 80 Emirati citizens, including prominent human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience, faced mass trials by UAE authorities. These trials were based on terrorism charges that had been fabricated.
And the problem essentially is that these charges really relate to the same conduct for which many of these defendants were charged the first time round.
For the second time, after a decade, the detainees were retried with the same charges they were previously convicted of and for which they had served their sentences in prison. This drained their energy, deteriorated their health, and took a toll on their families. New violations faced by detainees of conscience, members of the UAE94 group. After enduring years of imprisonment, under harsh conditions and suffering deprivation of basic rights, and repeatedly extending detention with excuses and justifications, lacking any legal basis, the time for the release of the detainees after serving their sentences arrived, but the trials they faced in July 2013 resurfaced once again. On December the 7th, 2023, the Emirati authorities levelled the same charges against a select group of activists, preachers, politicians and human rights defenders who were detained in the Emirates 94 case. They were accused of threatening state security by forming a secret organisation aimed at overturning the ruling system because they had signed a petition calling for democratic reforms in the country at that time. The reform petition included 133 citizens, men and women from various intellectual, legal, human rights and political backgrounds in the UAE. The petition was submitted to the President of the State and members of the Supreme Council, the 7 rulers of the Emirates. The signatories of the petition demanded the election of all members of the Federal National Council by all citizens, as practiced in democratic countries around the world. In addition to amending the constitutional articles related to the Federal National Council to ensure it has full legislative and oversight powers. Some of them were disappeared in prisons. With unjust charges and sentences beyond imagination, they were subjected to harsh humanitarian conditions. Once more the past echoed its refrain. The detainees themselves remain the same, as do the charges. Only the case name changed, turning into the UAE84. The accusations revolved around establishing and financing a terrorist organisation according to the 2004 Anti-Terrorism Crimes Law. And the terrorist organisation referred to here is the Justice and Dignity Committee, established by the Emirati Reform Society, concerned with freedom issues and human rights, which worked at the time to raise awareness among the Emirati society about its rights and engaged with international human rights organisations.
The UAE84, now they retrial again and they face death penalty.
Laws that were not available during the initial trials. In 2018, severe amendments were made and the new penal code was enacted, which further restricted freedom of opinion and expression in the Emirates. However, the underlying danger in the new law is the severe penalties for freedom and opinion-related issues, which can lead to execution. This threatens to result in death sentences against detainees in the UAE84 case, especially with the presence of vague anti-terrorism laws, like those enacted in 2014. which included ambiguous definitions of terrorism and allowed for the indefinite detention of detainees without charge or trial.
This is a new one, actually, not before they arrested. This is a new legislation that they came up with just to send them to the death penalty or life in prison.
The UAE authorities continued to detain detainees of conscience even after the end of their sentences, claiming they posed a threat to national security and needed rehabilitation. They introduced a concept similar to administrative detention used by the Israeli occupation against Palestinian detainees, which can last up to 6 months and be renewed each time on the pretext that the detainee may commit an act contrary to the law. The charge here is suspicion and conjecture. The concept introduced by the UAE authorities to extend the detention of opinion prisoners is known as counselling, where detainees scheduled for release are transferred from the prisons where they are held to the counselling centre area, which is within the same prison building but isolated from other blocks. Human rights organisations' ignorance.
The United Arab Emirates leadership has not moved an inch.
Human rights organisations have condemned the practices of the UAE authorities in continuing to detain detainees of conscience after the expiration of their sentences and retrialing them once again. Over 40 human rights organisations, including prominent ones like Amnesty International, issued condemnations and calls for urgent action from the Human Rights Council, UN member states, the European Union, and other regional institutions to compel the UAE to drop these new politically motivated charges and immediately release all detainees of conscience. Human Rights Watch considered the UAE's actions against detainees of conscience as revenge for merely forming an independent advocacy group in 2010. However, all these condemnations and calls for compliance with international and humanitarian laws have been met with a deliberate policy of ignoring by the UAE authorities. Since 2010, UN experts on human rights violations have sent more than 70 reports to the UAE, to which the UAE authorities responded to only 34. The latest UN report to the UAE was in January 2024, regarding violations in the trial of the UAE84. The report, spanning 23 pages with over 12 questions, requested an extension of the response period to 90 days instead of the usual 60. The UAE response, however, consisted of only 4 pages, which could be summarised in 2 pages at most, expressing gratitude to UN experts for their efforts in protecting human rights, without providing any information on the proceedings of the UAE84 case. The UAE justified this by claiming that commenting on the trial would constitute interference by the executive authority in the judiciary's independence and would infringe on the defendant's right to a fair trial. Trials on the eve of a UN conference.
And sadly, during COP28, while it was, still ongoing, and while it was actually being praised by the media as being a very successful COP, the authorities actually decided to launch a crackdown on civil society.
Simultaneously with the UN COP28 International Conference on Climate Change, held in Dubai in late 2023, Emirati authorities ordered the trial of detainees of conscience in the UAE84 case. This move shocked the world, as the political leadership in the UAE ignored UN laws responsible for the COP28 conference, during which the retrials of detainees of conscience were taking place on Emirati soil. This disregard prompted Michael Page, Deputy Middle East and North Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, to state, "The UAE has ramped up its assault on rights and freedoms despite calls to uphold its human rights obligations around COP28 climate conference," criticising the UAE for missing the opportunity to release unjustly detained activists and opposition figures, some of whom had already served their sentences, opting instead to further suppress their rights and keep them incarcerated. Ayam Majoub, Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International, expressed astonishment at the UAE's audacity to conduct sham trials during an international event like COP28. She viewed this as a sign of the UAE's authorities' unwillingness to address their poor human rights record and their readiness to suppress peaceful opposition. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch staged a protest on the sidelines of the COP28 conference, demanding the release of opinion detainees in the UAE. However, organisers later reported facing restrictions and harassment after displaying photos of detainees of conscience from the UAE. Persecution of detainees and their families. Detainees of conscience in UAE prisons have been subjected to the most severe forms of torture and ill treatment, both before and after their trials. Instead of fair trials, they faced fabricated charges of terrorism. Alongside them, their families endured another type of punishment. The Emirati authorities revoked the citizenship of many, leaving them without documentation, seizing their assets and funds, and terminating their employment. It wasn't uncommon for confessions to be extracted through coercion, forcing detainees to sign documents admitting to terrorist acts they had no involvement in. Trials were held in secrecy, with families often barred from attending. Occasionally, they were permitted to observe proceedings from a separate room via screens, with audio or visual feed being cut off at the discretion of security personnel. The detainees were denied the right to appoint independent lawyers. Instead, state-appointed attorneys, often working in tandem with judges and prosecutors, delivered predetermined accusations and judgments, ignoring legal and human rights norms. Many endured terrifying solitary confinement for months or even years, isolated from the world. Most of the detainees in the UAE84 case were placed in solitary confinement for a period of no less than 5 months before their trial. After long waits for release and eager anticipation for freedom, detainees and their families were shocked to learn of new trials only after the first session. According to some family members of detainees documented by Human Rights Watch, they were not informed in advance of the new charges or trials, learning of them only after the initial hearing, either from the detainees themselves or from advocacy groups supporting UAE detainees. During the UAE84 trials, visible signs of detainees' physical deterioration and weakened health were evident, confirming their mistreatment and deprivation of food and medical care for months. This highlights the systemic abuse and torture inflicted upon detainees who had not violated any laws. Even after the expiration of unjust sentences handed down in trials, they did not adhere to legal standards or human rights.
How is that? And this is against the law, as we know. You can't have another trial with the same problem and call it terrorist group, while it wasn't a terrorist group, while it was a peaceful organization.
This is the story of the UAE84, and it's not just a tale of an unjust trial, but a saga of years of injustice. It began with arbitrary arrests more than a decade ago, with detainees gradually becoming hostages in the hands of the Emirati authorities. It's a relentless process of vengeance in a state that claims to uphold tolerance. This vengeance knows no humane or legal bounds, governed by the whims of a handful of despots and tyrants. Their annoyance at the voices demanding reform led them to silence these voices forever and throw them into the abyss of prisons forever.